Welcome everyone to the Center X table. We are so happy to have with us today Tunette Powell, who is the specialist with the Center X Parent Project. He's been doing amazing work with parents and caregivers across the city, and so we thought we'd take this opportunity to get to know Tunette, to get to know the work she's been doing and what she sees as a future of the Center X Parent Project. So Tunette, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are your boys?
They are wonderful. It's been a great summer, so yeah.
Lots of travel and lots of sun?
Yes, yeah. They've had a great time. They have all these different things that they've wanted to do all summer, so now, I should say all year, and now they're getting the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Tunette has 3 beautiful boys who challenge her, but also inspired her to really think deeply and carefully about what it means to be authentically and effectively and deeply engaged with schools in the service of your children. And that really led into a more broader study about what does parent engagement mean,
Right.
for what purpose, for whom, and how. So why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and your research and the Parent Project?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have 3 sons, as you said. I have a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And so it's always busy at home. Mm-hmm. But, the oldest 2, I really have to say that they are the reasons why I even decided to, choose this type of career and pursue, the role and work of really thinking about parent engagement. And one of the things that was really important for that was when my kids were 3 and 4, they were suspended from preschool, and it was like this shock moment, this wake-up call.
Preschool?
Preschool, where it was just like, okay, what's going on? What am I going to do? And I think you have this moment where I'm either going to just fall off and, lose my mind because it was heartbreaking. But then it was also this opportunity for me to really say, okay, you do have a voice of some sort. How will you use that voice? And so, I started a PhD program here at UCLA, and really the idea was, after I shared my story about what was happening with my kids, I had so many other parents who were also sharing their story about this is happening to me. So the idea was, how do I use research and the platform that I have to be able to support other parents who are going through similar things and many other different issues when it comes to, school and education, and how do we think about, what it looks like for schools and families to thrive together and sometimes struggle together. Mm-hmm. And so, my research, I work with some of, the most alienated and pushed out parents, parents who have children who have been in trouble at school, suspended, expelled, you name it. And so I think it's been a really, really powerful thing for me because it's given me an opportunity to think about parents who we would think of as maybe the least engaged in the way that we think about engagement, mm-hmm. who are also very much so engaged and have mm-hmm. really struggled with what it looks like to, have experienced something that wasn't so good in an educational space and still trying to figure out how do I be there for my child. And so I feel like, from working with that particular population, it's allowed me to really, really be able to rethink what it even looks like to be engaged in school, and what can schools do and what can communities do to continue to build up these educational spaces that we want to be great equalizers.
Mm-hmm. So in your research and in your lived experience, what would you say were the 2 to 4 things that we all, as educators and as parents, need to understand about parent engagement if we're going to disrupt some of these patterns that are pushing kids, right. mostly kids that look like you and I, right. out of the school walls? Right. What are some of the things that we should know?
Right. I think, number one, I think that we have to, and this is something that, in my time of working with schools, is something that we all acknowledge, but I don't know if we work a lot toward it because it kind of gets left in the background, is we really have to be able to call out historical wrongdoing, even if it wasn't us individually who was there. You might think, oh, I wasn't in schools 50 years ago. It had nothing to do with what law was in place at the time. But we have to be willing to acknowledge that history, call it out, and before we can disrupt any of those things, because that history gets reproduced every day in little ways that really become big things, in very big ways, that for parents. And so I think it's also important to say that and know that parents are aware, right, of many of these things. I think that will probably be one. I think another thing that is extremely important is for us to be able to reconceptualize what it means to be engaged. So we have to go beyond physical presence. I think that, as a parent I consider myself highly engaged, but I don't think about engagement as I'm always there. I can't be. Right, I have a job, I'm in a PhD program. There are 3 kids, 2 at one school, but another at a different school. And even for my husband, he works 30 miles away from the boys' school. So it's not realistic for us to always be physically present. But what does it really mean to be engaged? And so a lot of that is how we use our imagination, how we rethink, how we go back to those childhood things that we did to really, really imagine what would it look like and what do we mean when we say engagement. I always talk, when I'm talking to educators, I'll say, say what you mean and mean what you say. Because my mother always told me that when I was a kid. And I really think that we have to think about what that really means. I also think that our idea of parenting is very narrow. And so one of the other things that I think is important for us, if we're going to do real work around authentic parent engagement, is to also push against some of these narrow ways that we've thought about parents, right? And it might not always be a mom and a dad, but don't discount that auntie, right? Or that grandma, that cousin, and all of the different family members, that neighbor across the street who never had any kids, but helped raise yours. And so I think that we have to be able to think more about village engagement, more so than just parent engagement.
Village engagement.
Yeah.
I love that. I love it. And when you think about the village includes the school.
Absolutely.
And the educators within the school walls. And you and I have talked about the narrow ways that schools define parent engagement and the desire to open that up and dream big about how do we not only have them show up for open house, show up for back to school night, show up for performances, show up for those kinds of celebratory activities, but really think carefully about the kinds of knowledge and skills that parents and other caregivers that the village brings into schools, cultural knowledge, community knowledge, how that is shared and taken up with educators to benefit the experience of school for young people. And I know that's one of the things that we've been grappling with and really trying to attend to within the Parent Project. And I know that you've been doing some work and thinking a lot about this as you think about the Parent Project moving forward. So how are you making sense of that, and what are you excited about in moving us in that direction?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think to your point of this idea of, families and community folks having so much knowledge, I think is extremely important. And some of the best lessons I've learned have been from working directly with parents. That even though, I think, even if they're not, certified in this or that, they have so much life experience where they'll say, you know what you ought to do? You know what I mean? If you sit, even if it becomes something like reading or math and all these things, you'll be surprised at what parents and families have done outside of school that makes such a big impact in school. And so I'm always looking for that knowledge. And
so where do we start to shift the way that we approach parent engagement? You've spoken about these kind of buckets of engagement and where we start and where we want to move through.
So here's what, and I want to talk about these buckets because I think of them as 3, right? There's these 3 buckets. And I think about them in order as well. And I'll tell you how we tend to conceptualize it in school. But think about these 3 steps, if we want to call them steps along the way. The first one is really around building authentic relationships. And I'm going to go back to this one because it's where we spend the least amount of time in schools. The second one is parent engagement. So that's where we have our parent workshops. That's typically where all the money is attached that we get, where it's like, we're going to give you some information. We're going to bring you in. It's really tied around physical, engagement. The last one is parents as leaders, right? Which is what we all ultimately want, or at least, that's what we've said we wanted. What we really want parents to be engaged and maybe have some role in decision-making processes and things like that. But I really, really think it's time for us to take a step back. I think that, and 2 steps back for some, to say, how do we really build relationships? And I think it's like any other relationship. If you got an email from me and we weren't really cool like that, you might delete it, you might ignore it. But if we're friends and you see that, I got to respond. Mm-hmm. That's my girl, right? Mm-hmm. And so very similarly, we haven't done that. We have not done that work to really, really say, how do I get to know you? Not to give you any information, not to tell you about, this college scholarship, even though that's important. But before I want to do any of that, I just want to know you, right? I want you to know who I am. Mm-hmm. I want to connect. And, and I think the reason why I say that's important, I have 2 memories that stick in my head very vividly. I was speaking to a group of new teachers, and I asked them about parent engagement. And one teacher, she talked about how her mother never felt comfortable coming to the school because she was a teen parent. This was a white young lady, but her mother was a teen parent. So even though she was, she looked like many of the teachers that her daughter had, she had a very different experience. And because she dropped out of school early because she was a teen parent, she felt like I could never go there. Mm-hmm. Now, if we got to know her before we just told her to show up for something, if we really took the work, mm-hmm. we might already know that story, and that story might not be one of shame, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so, so that's one example. Another example, when we think about language, I think about language so much in our work because I was talking to this one new teacher, and I said, well, tell me about parent engagement, for your mom. And she told this beautiful story about her mother being super engaged when she grew up in Mexico. And I said, it was a beautiful story. And I said, well, what happened when you moved to the United States? She said, my mother never walked into a school. And I said, why? And she said, because she didn't speak the language. Right. She never felt welcomed. Yeah. Now, I interact with people who I don't speak the same language as very often. Mm-hmm. And we struggle together because mm-hmm. I'm using Google Translate as much as I can and all these things. But we know that we are connected in a relationship, that mm-hmm. even if we don't speak the same language, or I speak broken, Spanish to them and they speak a little broken English to me, we care about each other. Mm-hmm. So we're going to continue to struggle together to get it right because we care. Mm-hmm. And that's really the work that schools have to do. And our community, right, as a village, we have to be willing to do that together.
I think it's really exciting that historically the project has really focused its work on the second and third bucket, the workshops, institutes, and then the parent leadership piece. And now stepping back and saying, those 2 things are great, but think about how much more powerful they would be if we spend some time and how do educators, from the principal to the teachers, to the plant manager, to whomever, all the adults in a school that interact with young people, how do we build strong relationships with parents and then move into these other 2 spaces, ultimately leading to these leadership roles where parents feel confident and in relationship with educators to make decisions that are in the best interest of their children and also for the school in general. So what are some ways that you're doing that now, the relationship building? What are some of the ideas that you have or you've talked to principals about?
Right. So a few things, and I think, one thing that's really important is that I know that in schools, more often than not, we have the most passionate people who want to get this right. Mm-hmm. That is so important to say because I work with educators every day and they're always super excited. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so ready to be trained, ready to learn from and with each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, the work that we've been doing lately is really how do we get in the room together and learn from and with each other, as educators who want to do right. And so some of the things that we're doing, there's a workshop that, I've been working on that's really about the simple ways that you can build relationships. Some of the simple. There are some other things, and I'll talk about that one next, but I give this example all the time. So remember I said my oldest 2 sons were suspended from school. Mm-hmm. So I never forget the first teacher that my middle son had after that had happened. She had no idea that he had ever been suspended, but when she saw me, she said, "Thank you for creating him." Now, that's a very small 5-second, but there was so much healing that happened in that moment. Yeah. Right? So one of the different workshop offerings is thinking about how do we take advantage of those small moments that we do have, mm-hmm. where it's not like you're writing out a whole thing or you're rehearsing something that takes a long time, but how do we use our language and those affirmations to speak life into parents and into children, because there is so much healing there. She didn't realize in that moment that not only did she heal me of what had happened in a past circumstance, but even my own childhood trauma of being in schools, right? And so it's so powerful. The other thing is just thinking about, how do we even engage with the community? And none of that is just figuring out, what gets the community going, right? Of where you are. And it used to be different. So a lot of times we'll talk about, when schools, we like for all black schools back in the day, were like, well, parents were super engaged and their engagement was different. It was a lot different then. A lot of times you lived in that community, which we know now, cost of living, highways, many other things have changed those dynamics, right? And so, people used to go to the same church and all different other, you're part of the same organizations. It's a lot different now. So we have to think about, what does that look like?
Particularly in a city like Los Angeles.
Exactly. Where it takes, you have to live wherever you can in this moment. So I think that, some of the things, as an example, is I'm working with a high school right now, planning their very first Freedom Dream Barbecue. And Freedom Dream Barbecue.
Freedom Dream Barbecue.
Freedom Dream Barbecue. And the concept of freedom dreams comes from a scholar named Robin Kelly, who wrote a book called Freedom Dreams. And it was basically this idea, when you look at people that have struggled, they haven't always come together, not only around the struggle, but also around this idea of our freedom dreams, right? The things that we believed, right, could also be. So it wasn't just around the struggle. It was around this collective idea that it wasn't always going to be this way. And so now I'm working with a high school to plan that first event, where it's like, in this particular community, people love to have a meal together. People love to get together and play dominoes and spades or whatever these different games are. So how do we create this convening where it's just about that? We don't have any information to give you. We don't have a handout, you know what I mean? We don't have any motive on what we're trying to do. But what happens is, when you sit down, have a meal with somebody, play over a card game, you get to know a lot about that person. They'll tell you about their kids, right? Oh, I have a ninth grader here, right? And so on and so on. How do we do that work? And this is one example of what the Parent Project is working with the high school to do.
I love how the Freedom Dream Barbecue builds relationships between parents and community members in school, but also amongst the community members. Because this is really about community, belonging, kinship, and development.
Yes.
Lots of good stuff on the horizon for the Parent Project. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you.